Hey there, G. Welcome back to the Podcast Show channel. We've got a really fascinating deep dive plan for you today. We're going to be drawing completely from this pile of source material that you've shared with us.
That's right. All based on the documents right here in front of us.
Exactly. And one of the intros you gave us, it just sets the stage so perfectly. It says, "Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Show where stories inspire and voices spark action. Today, we're diving deep into the extraordinary journey of one of the most iconic minds of our time, Elon Musk."
Iconic is definitely a word the sources seem to lean towards, one way or another.
For sure. And these sources, they promise it's not just, a dry tech rundown. They actually tell us to buckle up because this isn't just a story about technology, rockets, and electric cars. It's about wild dreams, insane risks, and the unshakable mindset of a man who's trying to shape the future of humanity.
That phrase, unshakable mindset, that seems key to how the sources frame him, this idea of immense drive of, well, not giving up.
Right. So our mission today, and we're being really strict about this, guided only by the information inside these specific sources you've handed us, is to really unpack everything they present about Elon Musk. His life, his career, how he thinks, the impact he's had, everything that's laid out in these papers.
Exactly. We want to explore what these notes, these articles actually say. We're extracting the core insights they offer together with you.
Yeah, I'm actually genuinely really curious to see the whole picture that emerges when we stick just to this specific set of information.
And sticking just to the sources is really the point here, isn't it? Our goal is basically to understand the narrative and the facts as they are presented within this particular source material. We're deliberately not bringing in, outside opinions or other facts. We're sort of acting as your guides through what these specific documents highlight as important about him.
It's like seeing his journey, or at least a version of it, through the lens these papers provide.
Precisely. A specific lens.
Okay, let's do it. Let's jump right in, following the structure we've pulled from the sources. And they start, naturally enough, with his early life. One of the notes actually titles this section, "Early Life, the Outsider, with a Mind of His Own."
An outsider. That framing itself is interesting.
It is. The material kicks off with the basics. Born in Pretoria, South Africa in 1971. But it moves pretty quickly beyond just the simple facts. It starts describing the kind of kid he was. The sources describe him as, quote, "a curious, introverted child."
Right. And that word introverted, it really stands out, especially with how the sources flesh it out. They say he was more at home with books than with people. That suggests, right from the start, a real preference for digging into information, maybe structured knowledge, rather than navigating, I guess, complex social stuff.
Yeah, the sources definitely present that as a core part of his early personality.
Fundamental.
And the examples the sources give, they really drive home this intellectual focus. They actually note he read the Encyclopedia Britannica for fun.
The Encyclopedia Britannica. Yeah, that detail provided right here in the sources, it says a lot, doesn't it? About maybe an unusual, definitely a deep intellectual curiosity, even as a kid. It implies this drive to just systematically soak up huge amounts of information.
Not your typical kid's reading list, that's for sure.
Not at all.
And the sources pair that with another really important detail. He apparently devoured science fiction novels like fuel for his imagination.
See, and the sources use that specific metaphor, like fuel. That's quite vivid. It suggests sci-fi wasn't just, escapism or fun. It was something that actively powered his thinking, maybe shaped how he saw possibilities, the future, technology.
Like it was feeding into those later really ambitious ideas.
Exactly. The sources imply the seeds for those huge visions later on might have been planted right there in those early reading habits. That's the connection the material seems to make.
But the sources don't shy away from the really difficult parts of his childhood either.
Yeah.
They state pretty directly that he was bullied relentlessly at school.
Relentlessly. Yeah, the sources use that word. It suggests it wasn't just, occasional teasing. It was persistent, painful. And that kind of adversity, especially when it's ongoing, like the sources describe, it can be incredibly formative, right? It shapes you.
Definitely. And they give a specific and frankly quite brutal anecdote. It says, one incident even left him hospitalized.
Yeah, I saw that in the notes. Hospitalized. That's severe. The sources include that detail, it seems, to really underscore just how bad the bullying was. It wasn't just words, it was physically dangerous, emotionally damaging, according to this material.
And the sources explicitly connect this hardship to his later character. They state, despite the pain, This early adversity hardened him.
Hardened him. So the sources draw a direct line there between the suffering, the pain, and developing resilience, maybe a kind of mental toughness. They frame that difficulty almost like a crucible, something that forged his character, maybe making him better able to handle pressure later on.
Which the sources definitely suggest he faced a lot of later.
Oh, yeah, based on what's coming up in these notes, absolutely.
They go on to say this adversity gave him the drive to escape, not just geographically, but mentally.
Now, that phrase from the sources, not just geographically, but mentally, that's really interesting. It suggests the escape wasn't just about leaving South Africa, physically getting out. It was also about maybe transcending his immediate difficult reality through his mind, through intellectual pursuits, grand ambitions.
Like his mind became the escape vehicle.
That's what the sources seem to imply, yeah. Maybe powered by all that reading we just talked about. It let him project himself into different futures, different possibilities, away from the present difficulties described here.
The sources also touch on his home life, mentioning a tense and difficult relationship with his father, Elon Musk. And they add that it's a topic Elon rarely speaks about.
Right. So the sources point to difficulties at home as well, not just at school. And the fact, noted by the sources, that he seldom discusses it, well, that adds a layer, doesn't it? Suggests it might have been a really significant, maybe even unresolved challenge from his past, according to this account.
So you put it all together, the introversion, the intense reading, the severe bullying, the difficult father figure, and then this powerful drive to escape. And the sources tell us, at 17, he makes the move, goes to Canada first, then later transfers to the University of Pennsylvania in the U.S. And the material boils down his motivation for all this moving to one single really potent goal. He wanted to be in the place where the future was being built.
Wow. That's quite a statement for a 17-year-old as presented in the sources. It's not about a specific job or even a field initially. It's about, geographical and intellectual positioning, wanting to be right at the cutting edge of innovation, of progress. The sources really portray this as a very deliberate, very strategic decision, all driven by this deep ambition related to the future.
So when you look at these beginnings, as laid out here in the sources, the hardship, the intellectual escape, that singular focus, the sources seem to be saying, look, you need to understand this foundation to really get the ambition and the resilience that came later. It seems like overcoming this difficulty was absolutely core to the person described in these documents.
Yeah, the sources definitely frame it that way, that the toughness, the drive, it was forged in that difficult early environment.
Okay, let's move on then, following the narrative in the sources.
Yeah.
Chapter 2, as they have it, is Zip2 and X.com, the first leap.
The first big move into the business world.
Right. And one detail that just jumps right out right after his university time.
Yeah.
According to the sources, he dropped out of Stanford after just 2 days.
2 days?
Yeah, that's pretty dramatic, isn't it? The sources give his reason, though. It says, because he saw the internet exploding and didn't want to waste a second. The sources frame this as this incredibly pivotal moment. He saw this huge opportunity, the internet boom just taking off, and felt this overwhelming urgency. Like he had to jump in now, not spend more time in academia.
It really highlights, according to the sources, the strong bias towards action, right? Prioritizing getting involved in the real world where things were happening fast over more theoretical learning at that specific point.
Yeah, an impatience, almost, as the sources describe it. Like the real world was moving way faster than school could keep up.
That seems to be the sense you get from the source material, yes.
So his first actual startup, the sources tell us, was Zip2. They describe it as a city guide software for newspapers.
Okay, so leveraging the early internet. Providing localized info for established media, the sources position this as his entry point into the tech industry proper.
And the sources really, really lean into the dedication required back then. They paint this incredibly vivid picture of his commitment. It says he lived in his office, showered at the YMCA, and worked day and night.
Wow. The sources use those specifics, living at the office, showering at the Y, to show this period of just extreme bootstrapping, right? Intense personal sacrifice. It wasn't just a job. The sources presented as completely all-consuming. Building that first company took everything, apparently, requiring immense grit.
And all that intense effort, according to the sources, it paid off. The outcome, they state, is 4 years later, Compaq bought Zip2 for $307 million. And his personal takeaway from that sale, the sources say, was $22 million at just 28 years old.
The sources frame that as his first really significant financial win. And $22 million at 28, I mean, the sources present that as a huge amount of money, a clear validation of the risk he took leaving Stanford and all that hard work, the living in the office stuff.
Now, this next bit is where the sources really seem to highlight something fundamental about his character as they see it. They point out, instead of relaxing, he bet it all again, this time on a wild idea, an online bank.
Yeah, the sources set at a real contrast there. He gets this life-changing money right, enough to maybe take it easy for a while, but nope. According to the sources, he immediately plows it all back into another, arguably even riskier venture. And the idea itself, an online bank, the sources specifically call that a wild idea for the time.
This online bank, the sources explain, became X.com, which later merged into what we now know as PayPal.
Okay, so the sources trace that lineage. From his initial online banking concept through X.com into PayPal, which really pioneered online payments. And the sources make a point of saying his vision for X.com was way ahead of its time.
What do you think the sources mean by that, way ahead of its time? What does that suggest about his foresight?
Well, based on the source's description, it suggests he was envisioning and actually trying to build this complex digital financial system before maybe the technology was quite there, or before the market fully grasped the potential. It implies, as the sources present it, this ability to see trends, see opportunities way further down the road than maybe most people were looking at that time.
But the sources are also pretty upfront about the struggles inside the company. They state flat out that his management style caused friction, and because of that friction, he was eventually ousted from the company he founded.
Right. So the sources make it clear this wasn't a smooth success story internally. They explicitly mention these interpersonal challenges, friction linked to how he managed things, and it led to this really difficult outcome, getting pushed out of the leadership of his own creation, X.com PayPal. That detail straight from the sources adds a really crucial layer, doesn't it? Shows that early success also came with the significant conflict and personal setbacks.
Yeah, definitely complicates the picture. But even though he was ousted, the sources confirm he still made a huge amount of money when it sold. They say still, when PayPal was sold to eBay for $1.5 billion, Elon walked away with $180 million.
So the sources show that even without being in charge right at the end, his initial stake, the company's massive success, meant this enormous financial return for him, much, much bigger than the Zip2 sale.
And the sources deliver this killer line right here, which seems to just capture his whole approach, at least as they portray it. Most people would retire. Elon doubled down.
That sentence, pulled straight from the sources. It's incredibly potent in describing his motivation as they see it. Doubled down. In this context, reading the sources, it means he took that massive fortune, enough money, as they say, for anyone to retire. And instead of, securing his own comfort, he committed almost all of it to launching new, even riskier, even more ambitious companies.
So the sources portray this as like an intensification of his drive, not a winding down.
Exactly. Not, I've made it, but okay, what's next? What's bigger? That's the sense you get from the sources.
And that pattern seems really key. Based on the sources, building something, selling it, and then immediately reinvesting everything, maybe even more, into the next huge, risky idea. It shows this willingness, described in the sources, to just keep putting it all on the line for a new vision, even after massive success, and even after experiencing significant setbacks like being ousted. Okay, so this brings us neatly to what the sources call PayPal and the first big win. They kind of use this as a bridge, a transition point in the narrative they're building.
Right, recapping that experience before launching into the next phase.
Yeah. The sources reflect on PayPal, saying, though Elon didn't get to finish the PayPal journey as CEO, that whole experience taught him valuable lessons about scaling a company and about how vision and execution can collide.
How vision and execution can collide. The sources explicitly call that out as a lesson learned. And thinking back to what the sources said about the friction, the management style, being ousted, it seems likely this refers to that, right?
Seems that way.
The sources suggest he learned that, having the big idea, the vision, that's only one piece. The nuts and bolts of actually running things day to day, managing people, processes the execution. That's where things can get really tricky. And where conflict can arise, even separating the original visionary from the operation, as the sources indicated happened with him at PayPal.
And as the sources keep emphasizing, he walks away with this huge fortune, $180 million, but he doesn't stop. They stated very clearly again, after the sale, Elon had enough money to never work again.
The sources really hammer this point home, it seems, to underscore the deliberate choice he made next. He wasn't driven by, needing to earn a living anymore. The motivation, according to the sources, shifted.
Right, because the sources draw this incredibly sharp contrast with what he actually did. It says, But instead of buying yachts and islands, he sat down and made a list of the 5 most important problems humanity faced.
Yeah, the sources use that classic imagery of extreme wealth yachts, private islands, to really highlight how different his path was. And the sources present this act, creating this list as this moment of really deep reflection, almost strategic planning, shifting his focus entirely from just building businesses, even successful ones, to identifying and tackling what he saw as the fundamental challenges for everyone, for humanity.
It's a huge shift in scale, as the sources describe it.
Yes.
And the sources, they actually give us that list, exactly as it appears in the material we have. First, the internet, already tackled. Okay, checks that one off.
Right. Zip2, PayPal, X.com, done, in his view, according to the sources.
Second, sustainable energy.
Okay, huge area, critical for the future.
Third, space exploration.
Right, moving beyond Earth, big thinking.
Fourth, artificial intelligence.
AI, another massive transformative technology. Lots of potential, lots of danger, maybe.
And fifth, human brain enhancement.
Wow, okay, that one's pretty out there. Directly intervening with the brain.
So the sources present this specific list as the direct result of his thinking process, a systematic rundown of what he decided were the absolute most critical areas for humanity's future, or maybe even survival. It's an incredible range, isn't it? From tech he knew well, like the internet, to these vast frontier challenges, space, AI, brain interfaces, and fundamental resource issues like energy. The sources basically say this list became his new roadmap.
His blueprint for the next couple of decades, it seems.
And the sources give us his reaction, his reported reaction, after drawing up this list. And again, it just highlights the sheer audacity the sources attribute to him. He supposedly said, okay, let's start fixing them.
Just like that, let's start fixing them. The sources present that quote as his immediate declaration of intent. It's not just, these are interesting problems. It's, right, I'm going to personally take these on, use the resources I have now to solve them. The sources portray this as the moment he really transformed, in his own mind, baby, from just a successful tech guy into someone actively trying to bend the arc of the future on a planetary, maybe even interplanetary scale.
This whole transition, as the sources describe it, from online payments to tackling perceived existential threats and opportunities for humanity, it really does illustrate a unique kind of drive, doesn't it? The sources suggest it's a drive motivated by this desire for massive impact, guided by a very specific vision for the future rather than just making more money. That's the narrative presented here.
Yeah, the money becomes the tool to pursue the vision, not the goal itself. That's the strong impression you get from reading this material.
Okay, so that list becomes the launch pad. And the first big venture off that list, the one the sources dive into next, is SpaceX betting everything on the stars.
Addressing point number 3 on his list, space exploration.
Exactly. The sources state he founded SpaceX back in 2002. And they lay out the absolutely massive vision behind it, the dream of making life multiplanetary.
Right. The sources define that huge ambition right from the start. It's not just about sending rockets up, it's about establishing human civilization permanently beyond Earth. The sources frame this as like a fundamental step for the long-term survival or maybe expansion of the human species.
A pretty big goal.
Understatement of the century, maybe.
But the sources immediately contrast that incredibly lofty dream with the brutal reality of trying to achieve it. They say, but building rockets isn't like building websites. It's hard, expensive, and full of explosions, literally.
Yeah, the sources make that contrast very explicit. He's succeeded in the software world, right? Zip2, PayPal. No, he's jumping into hardware. Yeah. And not just any hardware, but arguably some of the most complex, dangerous, expensive hardware there is. And the sources adding that word literally about the explosions. It just underscores that failure in rocketry often means spectacular, costly physical destruction. It's a whole different level of risk and physical consequence compared to coding, as the sources highlight.
And the sources waste no time detailing just how real those challenges were right from the start. They state, the first 3 rocket launches failed.
3 failures in a row. The sources show this wasn't like a smooth ramp up. It was immediate, repeated, very public failure.
And the sources describe the fallout from these initial failures. They say, investors pulled back, friends thought he was crazy.
Understandable, right. The sources indicate that these failures just shredded confidence. Investors, seeing money literally blow up, got cold feet. And even his personal circle, his friends, according to the sources, started questioning his sanity for pouring everything into this seemingly doomed venture.
The sources really build the drama of this period, bringing it to this incredibly critical point.
Yeah.
They state, he was down to his last dollars. If the 4th launch failed, it would be over. The sources make it absolutely crystal clear just how high the stakes had become.
Yeah, the sources frame this as the absolute edge of the cliff. He'd put what basically his entire PayPal fortune into SpaceX. The sources describe him as being on the brink of personal bankruptcy and the company just disappearing. That fourth launch attempt, according to the sources, was literally the last chance. Everything was riding on it.
And then the sources deliver the turning point with this really deliberate, almost understated simplicity. They just say, but it didn't.
Boom. All that tension the sources built up, just released in those 3 words, it didn't fail.
The sources give the exact date for this crucial success. On September 28, 2008, Falcon 1 successfully reached orbit.
That date, September 28, 2008, is presented by the sources as the moment everything pivoted for SpaceX. After those 3 failures, facing financial ruin, this success finally validated years of incredibly hard work, huge financial risk, and relentless effort as described in the source material.
And the sources state the immediate game-changing consequence of that success. NASA noticed and gave SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract.
Wow. So the sources show how that single technical achievement instantly unlocked this massive opportunity. Getting a major contract from NASA, the established giant in the field, provided not just essential funding, but also immense credibility for this private upstart.
It essentially saved the company, based on the source's description.
It certainly seems that way from the narrative here, yeah. A lifeline and a huge validation.
So the sources summarize the achievement of this whole period by saying, Elon had done the impossible. He built a private rocket company that worked. Now, based on everything the sources described, the cost, the difficulty, the failures, what exactly made it seem impossible?
Well, according to the source's own descriptions, you had the astronomical costs involved, the sheer technical complexity, the inherent danger, the literal explosions. Then there was the lack of any real precedent for a purely private company succeeding in this field, which was so heavily dominated by governments and massive aerospace contractors. Add to that the string of early failures wiping out funds and the widespread skepticism. The sources suggest that, yeah, conventional wisdom would have absolutely said it was impossible for a startup, funded mainly by one guy's .com fortune, to achieve what SpaceX did. The sources present his success as completely defying all those expectations and prevailing beliefs.
And this whole story, as the sources tell it, the repeated failures, the immense pressure, the brink of collapse, and then the final successful launch, it really is a powerful illustration of persistence, isn't it? The sources emphasize how he just kept going when, maybe the rational thing, according to others, would have been to quit after failure 1 or 2 or definitely 3, especially with his own money evaporating.
Absolutely. The sources paint a picture of extraordinary resilience and self-belief in the face of overwhelming odds and near universal doubt.
Now, incredibly, while all this drama with SpaceX was unfolding, the sources tell us he was also deeply involved in another incredibly ambitious venture, which shifts our focus to the next chapter in the sources, Tesla driving the world into the future.
Right, tackling problem number 2 on his list, sustainable energy, or at least a big part of it.
Exactly. The sources state that during the very same period he was trying to get SpaceX rockets off the ground, literally, he invested in another startup, Tesla Motors. Now, the sources clarify something important here. It wasn't his original idea, but he quickly became the driving force behind it.
That distinction is noted in the sources. He wasn't founder #1, but his involvement became absolutely central very quickly. So what did the sources imply by calling him the driving force?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Well, reading between the lines of the source material, it suggests he provided the crucial elements. The leadership, the overall strategic vision, probably a lot of the risk capital needed, and the relentless push to actually get things done. He effectively became the most influential person, the leader steering the ship, even if he didn't sketch the very first design on a napkin. That's the sense the sources give.
Okay, and the sources vividly describe the landscape for electric cars back when he got involved. They say EVs were basically seen as boring golf carts. No one took them seriously.
Right. The sources really set the scene here for the uphill battle Tesla faced. Electric cars had this image problem. Slow, limited range, maybe a bit dorky, definitely not something most people desired or saw as a practical alternative to gasoline cars. The sources present this as the prevailing perception he was up against.
But the sources immediately contrast that widespread view with his own conviction. But Elon did. And they detail his commitment, which follows the pattern the sources have already established. He poured in his own money, worked as CEO, and took enormous risks.
There it is again, right? Personal financial risk. Stepping into the top job, CEO, taking on huge uncertainty. The sources consistently highlight this pattern of deep personal and financial investment in these ventures. He apparently saw potential in electric mobility, where almost everyone else, according to the sources, saw a niche market or a technological dead end.
The sources then talk about the first model, the Roadster, and the immense difficulties it faced. They state it encountered production hell. And that didn't stop. The critics mocked it.
Production hell. The sources use that evocative phrase again.
Yeah.
So, based on the context of building cars, especially for a brand new company, the sources imply this refers to that incredibly complex, often chaotic, and painfully difficult stage of actually manufacturing something at scale, going from a cool prototype to reliably building thousands of them.
It sounds nightmarish.
Yeah, the sources suggest it involves everything from designing factories, setting up supply chains for countless parts, ensuring quality control, dealing with unexpected problems on the assembly line. It's vastly more complex than shipping software, and often plagued by delays and massive cost overruns. The sources indicate the Roadster phase was exactly that intensely difficult, and the critics mocking it suggest people outside the company were openly doubting if they could even pull it off, let alone make it profitable.
However, the sources state that the next model, the Model S, was the real game changer. It changed everything. It was fast, beautiful, and completely electric.
So the sources present the Model S as the breakthrough product, the one that completely shattered those old boring golf cart perceptions the sources mentioned earlier. It demonstrated, according to the sources, that an electric car could actually be desirable, high-performance, great-looking, technologically advanced, and a genuine competitor to luxury gasoline cars.
And the sources make a pretty bold claim about its impact. They conclude that with the Model S, Tesla redefined what a car could be.
That is a strong statement from the sources. It suggests Tesla's influence wasn't just about making a successful EV, it was about fundamentally shifting the entire auto industries and the public's expectations about vehicles, about performance, about software integration, about connectivity, about the very potential of electric powertrains. The sources credit Tesla, particularly the Model S, with driving that redefinition.
But even with this groundbreaking car, the sources emphasize the company's journey remained incredibly rocky. They state Tesla nearly went bankrupt several times.
Right. Another parallel the sources draw with SpaceX. These huge, ambitious ventures, according to the source material, repeatedly face existential financial crises. It reinforces just how high stakes these undertakings were, how close to failure they apparently came multiple times.
And the sources, yet again, illustrate his personal, hands-on commitment during these crises, echoing those earlier descriptions. It says, Elon slept on the factory floor, fought the press, and clashed with Wall Street.
That image, again, sleeping on the factory floor. The sources clearly use this recurring detail as a symbol of his absolute immersion during crunch times, being physically present, working alongside everyone. And the sources mentioning him fighting the press and clashing with Wall Street suggests the intense external battles he was waging simultaneously against media skepticism, against financial analysts maybe betting against the company during these periods where Tesla was, according to the sources, on the brink.
And the sources wrap up this chapter on a note of ultimate success, of vindication. They state simply, but in the end, he proved them wrong.
So the sources frame the whole Tesla narrative as this epic struggle against overwhelming odds, against industry inertia, technical challenges, financial crises, constant criticism, but ultimately resulting in proving that his vision for compelling mass-market electric vehicles wasn't just possible, but transformative. He proved the doubters wrong, according to this account.
Yeah, the Tesla story, as laid out right here in the sources, it really does showcase the immense challenges, but also the potential rewards of trying to disrupt a truly massive, deeply entrenched global industry like automaking. The sources detail the resistance, the internal chaos, the external fights, and finally, the success in fundamentally changing the conversation and the direction of the entire industry towards electric cars. Okay, so as if juggling SpaceX near failures and Tesla's production hell wasn't enough, the sources make it clear that Elon Musk's ambitions didn't stop there. This leads us into the next section of the source material covering Solar City, Neuralink, and the Boring Company. The sources introduce this by saying Elon Musk isn't the kind of guy to settle for just one revolutionary company. And they note that even while running Tesla and SpaceX, he was launching other ventures, each as ambitious as the next.
Yeah, the sources really reinforce this idea that his drive just kept expanding. It wasn't confined to just one or two huge problems. It branched out across multiple frontiers, all seemingly stemming back to that initial list of 5 big challenges he identified after PayPal, according to the sources.
Right. So first up in this batch, the sources mention Solar City. They describe it as a company co-founded by cousins, heavily backed by Musk. And its stated goal, according to the sources, was pretty straightforward: to accelerate the adoption of solar energy.
Okay, so SolarCity clearly lines up with the sustainable energy point on his list, as presented by the sources. And the sources mentioning he heavily backed, it indicates he wasn't just a passive investor. He likely provided significant funding and strategic influence, even though his cousins were the co-founders. It was part of his broader energy play, according to the sources.
And the sources tell us the eventual fate of SolarCity. It says Tesla acquired it in 2016, integrating it into its clean energy ecosystem.
So the sources show how SolarCity eventually got folded into the bigger Tesla picture, creating this clean energy ecosystem. Now, based on what the sources have already told us about Tesla electric cars, battery storage like the Powerwall, what does that phrase likely mean in this context?
Well, the sources seem to imply it's about creating a whole integrated system, right?
Yeah.
Where you generate clean energy with solar panels from SolarCity, you store that energy in batteries, Tesla Powerwalls, and then you use that energy to power your home and your electric car, Tesla vehicles.
Exactly. The sources portray this acquisition as a strategic move towards a more holistic energy solution, combining generation, storage, and consumption all under the Tesla brand, aiming for a complete sustainable energy package for consumers, as presented in this material.
Okay, then the sources introduce Neuralink, and they label it a neurotechnology company.
Yeah.
Its goal, as stated right here in the sources, is, well, it's incredibly futuristic, trying to build brain-machine interfaces. The sources even add a little note here. Yes, you heard that right, almost acknowledging how sci-fi this sounds.
Yeah, the sources definitely flag this one as being on the extreme cutting edge, brain-machine interfaces. I mean, the sources are talking about creating direct communication links between the human brain and computers or other devices. It's presented as a truly audacious leap into, well, the future of humanity, potentially.
The sources explain the main reason given for pursuing this. He apparently wants to help humans directly interact with computers using their brains. And the sources immediately inject that little note of skepticism, or maybe just wonder, crazy? Maybe.
The sources acknowledge upfront that this whole concept might seem completely outlandish to a lot of people.
But they also provide Elon's stated motivation, at least according to the sources. He sees it as a way to keep up with AI.
Okay, that's a critical piece of context provided by the sources for understanding Neuralink's purpose, as presented here. The sources imply he views artificial intelligence advancing so rapidly that humans risk being left behind, becoming irrelevant maybe, and that enhancing our own cognitive abilities by directly linking our brains to computers is, in the view presented by the sources, a necessary step for humanity to maintain parity or maybe even control in a future dominated by advanced AI.
Wow. That's a heavy motivation.
Very. It positions Neuralink, according to the sources, not just as a medical device company, but as potentially crucial for the long-term future of the human species in relation to artificial intelligence.
Okay, and the final company mentioned in this cluster by the sources is the Boring Company, which they state was founded by Elon. And the origin story the sources provide is quite interesting. They say it started as a joke, literally a tweet about traffic, but turned into a real venture. The sources make a point of highlighting that surprisingly casual start.
Yeah, the sources point that out specifically, that this potentially major infrastructure project aimed at solving urban transport issues actually began as a moment of public frustration expressed on Twitter. It kind of demonstrates that tendency the sources have described throughout seeing a problem, even an everyday one like traffic, and then quickly moving to try and solve it, even if the initial idea seems almost whimsical.
And its purpose, as stated clearly in the sources, is digging underground tunnels to reduce urban congestion.
So the sources present this as a direct attack on a very real, very frustrating problem: city traffic. And the solution proposed by the Boring Company, according to the source material, involves developing faster, cheaper tunneling technology to create networks of underground roads or transit systems, getting traffic off the surface.
So when you look at this whole collection of ventures described by the sources, SolarCity for energy, Neuralink for brain AI interface, the Boring Company for transportation, on top of SpaceX for space and Tesla for cars, the sheer range is just incredible. The sources really paint a picture of someone whose problem-solving focus spans across incredibly diverse, fundamental areas of technology and human life. It shows a mind, as described here, that's constantly scanning for what it perceives as the biggest leverage points or biggest problems, and then just diving in, regardless of the field.
Yeah, the scope described in the sources is just enormous. Each one of these would be a life's work for most entrepreneurs. The sources suggest he's tackling them all simultaneously.
Now, beyond the companies themselves, the sources dedicate quite a bit of space to his very public persona and the controversies that seem to constantly swirl around him. This brings us to the chapter the sources label Twitter, X, and Elon's public persona.
Right, a more recent and very high-profile development covered in the material.
Definitely. The sources highlight this major event. In late 2022, Elon shocked the world by buying Twitter, and the sources make sure to underscore the sheer scale of this deal, stating he bought it for $44 billion.
$44 billion. Yeah, the sources use that phrase, shocked the world, to convey just how unexpected and massive this move was. Buying one of the world's most influential communication platforms, it was a huge financial gamble and instantly grabbed global headlines precisely because of Twitter's role in politics, news, and, well, public discourse. The price tag mentioned by the sources just reinforces the enormous scale.
And the sources mentioned the first big visible change he made right away. He renamed it X. And they give his stated ambition for the platform, too. He promised to transform it into an everything app.
The sources present the renaming to X and this everything app idea as his declared vision for where he wanted to take the platform. Now, based on the source material mentioning his deep background in online payments with PayPal and X.com, what would an everything app likely entail, as promised here?
Well, the sources seem to suggest it's about integrating a whole bunch of functions into one place, right? So social media, messaging, maybe news, but also, crucially, payments, finance, maybe shopping, video. Basically trying to become the single digital hub for a user's life.
Exactly. The sources report this as his stated goal, moving far beyond just short messages into this much broader, integrated digital platform.
However, the sources are very quick to point out that this whole takeover and transformation, well, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, they state quite plainly. But things didn't go smoothly.
Understatement, perhaps, based on the subsequent details in the sources. They indicate that his ownership and the changes he started making immediately ran into significant problems and generated a lot of negative reaction.
The sources list some specific actions that caused these problems. Mass layoffs, policy changes, reinstating controversial accounts.
Right. These specific actions, as listed right here in the source material, are presented as the key drivers of that negative response. Mass layoffs obviously disrupt the company massively, affecting operations, morale. Rapid, sometimes seemingly arbitrary policy changes create confusion and frustration for users and advertisers. And reinstating accounts that were previously banned, especially ones considered highly controversial or dangerous, directly impacts how safe or reliable the platform is perceived to be, as outlined in the sources.
And the sources describe the overall result of these actions. It stirred massive backlash.
Yeah, massive backlash. The sources indicate a really strong negative reaction from many different quarters, users leaving, advertisers pausing spending, media criticism, employee lawsuits, and so on.
The sources then capture the resulting split in how people viewed the whole thing. They say, while some hailed it as a free speech revolution, others saw it as chaos.
And the sources present those as the two main opposing viewpoints. One perspective, reported by the sources, framed the changes, especially around content moderation and reinstated accounts, as a necessary correction towards more open, absolute free speech. The other perspective, also reported by the sources, saw the same changes as destabilizing, poorly managed, and leading to a breakdown of safety and norms on the platform. The sources just lay out these two conflicting interpretations as existing side by side, highlighting how contentious his leadership of X became.
The sources also zoom out a bit to discuss his public presence more generally, especially online, describing it as always been a double-edged sword.
Double-edged sword. The sources use that metaphor, suggesting his very direct, often unfiltered public communication, particularly on platforms like Twitter X itself, has both upsides and villain sides. Maybe it helps him connect directly with fans or announce news quickly, but it also clearly leads to controversy and problems, according to the sources.
They give examples of the kind of things he posts, based on the sources. He tweets memes, product announcements, and sometimes controversial opinions.
Right. The sources illustrate that mix the informal, sometimes jokey stuff, memes, the official business product announcements, and then the stuff that lands him in hot water, controversial opinions. The sources imply it's this unpredictable blend that makes his online presence so potent and contributes to that double-edged sword effect.
And the sources wrap up this section with a summary of his overall public standing, resulting from all his ventures and this online activity. He's both admired and criticized, but never ignored.
That final bit, but never ignored, highlighted by the sources, feels like a really key observation about him. Whether people love him or hate him, the sources indicate his actions, his companies, his tweets. They command attention, they generate news cycles, they spark debate, and that's likely a direct result of the sheer scale of what he's involved in, as described by the sources, combined with that often provocative, unfiltered communication style they also detail.
It seems the sources definitely connect his personal public persona, that very active, sometimes inflammatory online style, directly to his leadership and the controversies surrounding X, formerly Twitter. His own communication habits, as detailed in the sources, became deeply intertwined with the platform he bought and the reactions to the changes he made there. The sources show a feedback loop, almost.
Yeah, the line between the man and the platform became incredibly blurred, according to the narrative presented here.
Okay, so building on that theme of his public profile, the sources then dedicate a specific section just to the wider controversies and criticisms that have marked his career, looking beyond just the Twitter situation. They introduce this part by stating, Elon Musk isn't just famous for his companies, he's infamous for stirring controversy.
Infamous. That's a strong word the sources choose to use there. It explicitly links him not just to fame for his achievements, but also notoriety for generating conflict and negative attention.
And the sources provide some concrete examples to illustrate this point. They mention him, quote, calling a British cave rescuer a pedo guy.
Right. That specific incident is cited by the sources as a prime example of his public statements sparking huge outrage and legal trouble due to the extreme nature of the unfounded accusation.
Another example the sources list is him making questionable COVID-related statements.
The sources point to this as another instance where his public comments, shared widely due to his platform, generated significant controversy and criticism, especially within the context of public health guidance during the pandemic. The sources themselves label the statements questionable.
Based on these examples, and maybe others implied, the sources offer a summary of his general approach. Elon has never played it safe.
The sources interpret these moments, and likely his overall behavior, as demonstrating a consistent pattern of risk-taking, not just in business like starting SpaceX or Tesla, but also in his public communication. A willingness, or maybe even a compulsion, to say things that are provocative, that challenge norms even when they generate widespread backlash, according to the sources.
The sources also list some specific accusations that have been directed at him or his companies over the years, and they are careful to frame them as such. These are accusations mentioned in the source material. They list accusations of union busting, environmental negligence, and creating a toxic work culture.
Right. And it's crucial, as you said, to note how the sources present these as accusations he has faced. They relate to the operational side of his businesses, concerns about labor practices, specifically interfering with union organizing, union busting, questions about the environmental footprint of his manufacturing, perhaps, or battery materials, environmental negligence, and criticisms about the internal working conditions and management style within his companies. Toxic work culture. The sources are reporting that these criticisms exist and are part of the public discussion surrounding him and his companies.
Yes, absolutely essential to remember. The sources are reporting on these accusations, not necessarily validating them as proven facts within this material.
Exactly. It's part of the complex picture the sources are painting.
So after laying out these controversies and criticisms, the sources offer this more nuanced, concluding assessment of how he's viewed, acknowledging the complexity. It says, while many still admire his brilliance, others question the human cost of his relentless ambition.
The sources articulate that duality really clearly there. On one side, continued admiration for his intellect, his achievements, his brilliance. On the other side, serious questions and criticisms about the potential negative consequences, the human cost, that might result from his intense, unwavering drive, his relentless ambition. The sources suggest both these views exist strongly and simultaneously in the public perception.
And the sources end this section with a really powerful sentence that tries to capture his complexity, rejecting those easy hero-villain labels. It reads, he's not a hero, he's not a villain, he's a complex human being trying to push the limits of what's possible, sometimes at great personal and ethical cost.
That is a very deliberate framing by the sources. They explicitly step away from simple good-bad judgments. Instead, they define him by what they see as his core motivation, trying to push the limits of what's possible. But, crucially, the sources immediately balance that ambition with a direct acknowledgement of the negative side effects that the sources themselves have described, stating that this push comes sometimes at great personal and ethical cost. The sources essentially urged the listener to hold both aspects in mind, the drive and the reported costs, seeing him as this complex figure.
And considering these criticisms, these controversies, as the sources present them, it really does feel important for getting a rounded picture of his impact, doesn't it? The sources make it very clear that the story they're telling isn't just about tech breakthroughs and business wins. It also includes these significant shadows, these challenges, criticisms, and reported negative consequences.
Absolutely. The sources present a picture with both light and shade.
Okay, so with all that context, the ventures, the persona, the controversies, the sources, then try to get to the heart of it all. What makes someone like this tick? This leads to the chapter on Elon's mindset, habits, and work ethic. The sources ask the question right out. What drives someone like Elon Musk? And they give their answer immediately. The answer lies in his mindset.
So the sources locate the root cause firmly in his way of thinking, his mental framework, his approach to the world. They suggest his actions stem from a fundamental cognitive and maybe ideological place.
And a core concept the sources really emphasize as being central to that mindset is his obsession with something called first principles thinking.
Right. And the sources offer a definition for it, breaking down problems to their core truth and rebuilding from there.
Okay, core truths. Can you unpack that a bit more? Like, what does that look like in practice based on the examples the sources gave us, like with SpaceX rockets or Tesla cars?
Sure. So based on how the sources describe his approach with those companies, first principles thinking seems to mean you don't start by looking at how things are currently done. You don't say, okay, a rocket costs X million dollars because that's what Boeing or NASA charges, or an electric car battery costs Y because that's the industry standard. Instead, you ignore all that existing stuff, all the ideologies and conventions. You go right back to the absolute fundamentals.
Like physics.
Exactly. Physics, material science, basic economics. So for rockets, as implied by the sources saying SpaceX built things differently, it might mean asking what materials absolutely have to go into a rocket. What are the fundamental laws of physics governing getting mass into orbit? How much do the raw materials, the aluminum, the fuel, actually cost if you buy them on the open market, not as finished components from traditional suppliers? By breaking it all down to those basic building blocks, those core truths, the sources suggest you might discover ways to build things radically cheaper or more efficiently than anyone thought possible because you're not trapped by existing assumptions.
And for cars.
Similarly, the sources describing Tesla's focus on battery tech and innovative design suggest it wasn't about just slightly improving a gasoline car or tweaking existing EV designs. It was more like rethinking energy storage from the level of battery chemistry, or rethinking vehicle manufacturing processes from scratch based on fundamental engineering principles. The sources present this first principles method as his key tool for achieving disruptive innovation, questioning everything down to the base level, and rebuilding the solution based only on what's fundamentally true, not just on how it's been done before.
That makes sense. It's like refusing to accept that's just how it is.
Precisely. The sources portray it as a relentless questioning of assumptions.
The sources also, of course, go into detail about his legendary, maybe infamous, work ethic. They state he famously works 80 to 100 hours a week.
Yeah, the sources highlight that number 80 to 100 hours is just an incredibly demanding level of personal commitment, way, way beyond a standard work week.
And the sources add a crucial detail. He expects the same from his teams.
Right. And the sources note that this intense expectation isn't just for himself, it extends to the people working for him. Now, remembering what the sources mentioned earlier about those accusations of a toxic work culture, this detail about expecting 80, 100-hour weeks from everyone seems potentially connected, doesn't it? The sources imply this intense demand could be a major factor in creating that kind of high-pressure, perhaps unsustainable work environment that critics described.
Yeah, that connection seems pretty clear in the way the sources present it. And we see that other specific habit mentioned multiple times by the sources popping up again here. He sleeps at the factory. It's striking how the sources repeat this detail for Zip2, for Tesla, and I mention it again here talking about his general work ethic.
It really is. The sources seem to use this recurring image sleeping on the factory floor almost as a powerful symbol. It represents, in their narrative, his total immersion, his absolute dedication, especially during make-or-break moments for his companies. It's presented as this physical embodiment of his willingness to be right there in the trenches, working nonstop alongside the teams, sacrificing personal comfort for the mission, as described by the sources.
Another habit the sources mention is that he micromanages every detail.
The sources identify this as a key characteristic of his management style, being involved in everything down to the smallest specifics. Now, this level of intense, detailed control, combined with the expectation for extreme hours that the sources also mention, you can see how that combination could contribute to that pressured work environment the sources alluded to, and perhaps relates to those criticisms about management style or culture. The sources imply his focus is incredibly granular across all his projects.
But the sources also draw a really important distinction about what's ultimately driving all this intense effort. They state, but it's not just about hard work, it's about vision.
Right. The sources emphasize that the crazy hours, the micromanagement, the sleeping at the factory, it's all in service of something bigger. The drive, according to the sources, isn't just working hard for its own sake, it's directed laser-like towards achieving those huge, ambitious goals he set out.
And the sources present their conclusion about what really fuels him deep down. They say, he genuinely believes in what he's building. He's not chasing money. He's chasing a future he thinks is worth living in.
The sources frame his core motivation here as fundamentally idealistic, almost missionary. His primary goal, according to this material, isn't accumulating wealth. It's realizing this specific vision he has for humanity's future, a future involving sustainable energy, space exploration, AI integration, etc., that he genuinely believes is better, or even necessary. The sources suggest that the money, the companies, they are presented as tools, as means to achieve these much larger future-shaping ends, rather than being the ultimate goals themselves.
And the sources neatly tie this back by listing those big goals again in this summary section, connecting directly to that list we discussed from Chapter 3. It says, whether it's Mars, AI-human symbiosis, or sustainable energy, Elon's goals are bigger than life.
Yeah, the sources explicitly link his day-to-day intensity, his work habits, back to that original roadmap of grand challenges. It reinforces, as described throughout the sources, this sense of a consistent, overarching, almost monumental motivation driving all his diverse activities.
Thinking about this mindset, as the sources lay it out, the first principles, the vision driving the work ethic, the sheer scale of ambition, you can see how elements of that could be incredibly powerful for tackling really hard problems, couldn't you? Even if you don't, or can't, replicate the extreme hours or the micromanagement the sources describe. The sources present a compelling model for thinking radically differently about problem solving.
Definitely. The sources suggest that the way he approaches problems, breaking them down, aiming high, being vision-driven, has transferable value, independent of the more extreme personal habits also described.
Okay, so bringing this whole deep dive, based purely on the source material, towards its conclusion, we land on the final chapters dealing with impact and legacy. The sources pose the question very directly. So what will Elon Musk be remembered for?
Yeah, the sources acknowledge it's still early days, his story is far from over, but they start to speculate on what his most significant, lasting contributions might be, based on the transformative effects of the companies and actions they've already discussed.
And the possibilities the sources offer are pretty significant, covering the main ventures we've talked about. They list, maybe it's the way he forced the auto industry to go electric.
Right. Shifting a massive global industry onto a completely new technological path, that's a huge potential legacy item highlighted by the sources.
Or how he reignited humanity's interest in space.
Yeah, making space exciting again and proving private companies could lead the way, another major potential impact noted by the sources.
Maybe it'll be Neuralink or X or something else he hasn't even started yet.
So the sources also keep the door open. Maybe his biggest legacy will come from these newer, even more future-focused ventures like brain interfaces or the Everything app, or maybe something entirely unforeseen that aligns with his stated goals. The sources suggest the sheer scale of his current activities means his legacy is likely to be tied to multiple significant global changes.
But even with that uncertainty about which specific achievement will be seen as most important down the line, the sources reach a very clear, very definitive overall conclusion, they state. Whatever the case, Elon Musk has changed the world.
That's a pretty unambiguous statement from the sources. They make this strong assertion about the undeniable scale of his influence already. Regardless of how history eventually weighs his various contributions and controversies, the sources conclude that his impact on multiple key industries, on technology trajectories, on global conversations, as detailed throughout this material, is already profound and irreversible.
And the sources offer one final, very memorable line that sums up his unique, unignorable position in the world today. Love him or hate him, you can't ignore him.
Yeah, that concluding sentence from the sources really captures his status as this larger-than-life, globally prominent, and often deeply polarizing figure. And based purely on what the sources have laid out, the sheer scale of the companies he leads, their impact on cars, space, energy, communications, AI, combined with the constant stream of controversies and his high-profile public persona, all described here, you can absolutely see why the sources would conclude that. He generates strong reactions, positive and negative, but his presence, as presented by the sources, is simply impossible to disregard.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Thinking about everything the sources presented, pushing for electric transport, aiming for Mars, delving into brain tech, reshaping global communication. What do you, listening to this, think might be his most significant long-term impact based on this material? The sources give possibilities, but that idea of fundamentally changing how humanity moves or where we might live, that feels almost uniquely profound in the context of the sources, even if the full results are generations away.
It's a huge question the sources leave us with.
Okay, as we officially wrap up this deep dive, guided meticulously by the source material you provided, the conclusion section in the material actually offers some explicit bullet point style key takeaways from Elon's journey as they've presented it.
Right, distilling the lessons the sources see in the story.
Yeah, the sources list these directly. First, think bigger.
Reflects the sheer scale of his ambitions described by the sources. Mars, sustainable civilization, AI symbiosis, aiming incredibly high.
Second, act faster.
Speaks to that urgency the sources highlighted, dropping out of Stanford, pushing production timelines, moving quickly on perceived opportunities or threats.
And third, don't wait for permission.
Right, that connects to him building private companies in areas dominated by governments or huge incumbents like space or autos. Just going ahead with his vision, according to the sources, despite skepticism or the lack of established paths. The sources present these three: think bigger, act faster, don't wait for permission as core operating principles driving his success as they see it.
The sources also make this direct statement. Elon Musk didn't become Elon Musk by following the rules. He challenged them, he broke them, he redefined them.
And thinking about that in the context of the industries, the sources described him entering cars, space, banking, energy. What does that mean? It means, according to the sources, he didn't accept the existing ways of doing things, the established cost structures, the slow development cycles, the regulatory assumptions. He challenged all of that. He broke from the conventional wisdom about what was possible, what was affordable, or even what consumers wanted. And by doing that, the sources suggest, he fundamentally redefined the rules of the game in those industries, forcing incumbents to react and setting new benchmarks for innovation, speed, and private sector capability in areas previously thought untouchable.
The sources then summarize the personal qualities they believe enabled him to do all this. They attribute his success to a mixture of courage, genius, and relentless drive. The sources specifically choose those three words.
Yeah, it's a potent combination highlighted by the sources. Courage, the bravery needed, according to the sources, to even attempt things others called impossible or crazy, and to risk everything repeatedly. Genius, the intellectual horsepower, as presented by the sources, to understand deeply complex technical fields, to apply first principles thinking, to solve hard problems, and relentless drive, that unwavering determination the sources described, pushing through failure after failure, immense pressure, criticism, never giving up on the vision. The sources suggest it's the specific blend of traits that fueled his extraordinary trajectory.
Then the sources offer a final, quite important thought, directed specifically at you, the listener. They frame it as a potential personal application, but with a really crucial disclaimer. They state, that doesn't mean we should all be like him.
Right. The sources explicitly pump the brakes there. They acknowledge the extreme nature of his methods, the controversies, the personal and ethical costs they mentioned earlier. The sources are saying, hold on, the lesson here isn't necessarily to emulate everything about him, given the downsides described in this material.
But then the sources immediately follow that with a more constructive, encouraging alternative perspective. They suggest, but maybe we can all learn to take a few more risks, dream a little bigger, and care a little more about the future.
So the sources suggest we can extract certain positive principles from his story, as they've told it, and apply them more broadly in our own lives or work. Taking calculated risks, maybe pushing ourselves beyond our perceived limits, expanding our ambitions, thinking on a larger scale than just the immediate or conventional, and maybe fostering a deeper sense of personal responsibility or investment in actively shaping a better future. These are presented by the sources as valuable, more universally applicable lessons that can be drawn from his journey, even without adopting the more extreme or controversial aspects of his approach detailed here. You know, As we reflect on this whole narrative presented by the sources, it paints this picture of someone attempting to steer the very course of human development across so many critical areas at once: space, energy, AI, biology, transport, communication. All driven by this stated goal, according to the sources, of chasing a future he thinks is worth living in and actively trying to fix what he sees as humanity's biggest problems. When you consider that sheer scale of vision and the power he's accumulated to pursue it, as described in these sources, and then you weigh that against the successes but also the significant controversies and costs that the sources also detail, it really does leave you with a profound question based solely on this material. What kind of responsibility comes with that level of influence? When an individual's vision and power reach a scale where they could genuinely impact the future of our entire species, what ethical considerations arise? And looking only at what the sources have laid out, does the sheer audacity and potential upside of the ambition described somehow balance out, or at least provide context for, the very real challenges, criticisms, and ethical questions that the sources also raised? That's a heavy question, a complex tension that this specific set of source material leaves us to grapple with.
It really is. A lot to think about there, stemming directly from the information presented. And that really does bring us to the end of this particular deep dive, where we've journeyed entirely through the source material you shared with us. We've explored the challenging beginnings, the incredibly ambitious ventures, the public persona and struggles, that intense driving mindset, and the potential legacy, all based strictly on the notes and articles we had in front of us.
It's been quite the exploration sticking just to these documents.
It really has. Now, pulling directly from the outro text provided in the sources, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Podcast Show.
Our pleasure to guide you through it.
And the sources encourage engagement, so we'll echo that. If you found Elon's journey as fascinating as we did, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this, and don't forget to share this episode with a friend who loves innovation and big ideas.
Yeah, definitely share it if you found this breakdown of the source material useful.
Looking ahead, the sources promise. We've got more amazing stories coming your way, so stay tuned.
We look forward to digging into the next set of materials with you.
And finally, the closing words from the source material. Until next time, take care and keep dreaming big. And from us, just a sincere thank you, listener, for joining us on this detailed exploration through this specific set of source material. It was a really revealing journey sticking just to these documents, and we genuinely appreciate you bringing this fascinating, complex topic to the deep dive.
Thanks for listening.